Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Man Stories. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Daniel Stormcrow and I've been a park ranger for 21 years. I'm telling you this story because someone needs to know what really happened up at Grinnell Glacier in July of 1988. Most people won't believe me, but I don't care anymore. I'm getting old, and this thing has been eating at me for too long. I work at Glacier National Park in Montana. Been here since 1967, right after I got back from Vietnam. The mountains helped me forget some things I saw over there. At least, they did until that summer. I'm Blackfeet Nation, born and raised on the reservation just outside the park. My grandmother used to tell stories about things that lived in the ice, ancient demons that the cold kept sleeping. She called them the hungry cold ones. I never believed those stories. I figured they were just old ways of explaining avalanches and why people sometimes went missing in the mountains. That July was strange from the start. We had a cold snap that dropped temperatures 20 degrees below normal. Not unheard of in the high country, but weird enough that the Weather Service kept scratching their heads. The glaciers were acting up too, lots of cracking and groaning sounds that we could hear for miles. I specialize in backcountry rescue. When people get lost or hurt in places where helicopters can't reach, they send me. I know every trail, every peak, every hidden valley in this part of the park. Or at least I thought I did. The call came in on July 15th. A climbing team hadn't checked in at their scheduled time. 3 experienced mountaineers, Janet Morrison, Paul Henderson, and Mike Torres, had permits to climb in the Grinnell Glacier area. They were supposed to radio in every 12 hours, but we hadn't heard from them in 2 days. Their last known position was a hidden valley behind the main glacier face. Not many people knew about it. You had to do some ski, RIAS technical climbing just to get there, and there were no established routes, the kind of place where if something went wrong, you were on your own. Chief Ranger Williams called me into his office that morning. He looked worried, which was unusual for Bill. He'd seen everything in his 30 years on the job. "Dan, I need you to check on those climbers," he said. "Something feels off about this one." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Got a call from the weather station. They're picking up some strange readings from that area. Temperature drops that don't make sense. And..." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Had a few calls from folks on the reservation. Elders are saying the ice is talking again." I almost laughed at that, but Bill's expression stopped me. "You don't believe that stuff, do you?" "I believe in being careful," he said. "Take the radio, extra batteries, and enough supplies for 3 days. And Dan, if you find them and if they're gone, don't take any chances trying to bring them back alone." Looking back now, I should have paid more attention to that warning. I started the hike before dawn the next morning. The trail to Grinnell Glacier is tough but familiar. I'd been on it hundreds of times. What wasn't familiar was how cold it got as I climbed higher. By the time I reached the glacier's edge, my breath was coming out in thick clouds even though the sun was blazing overhead. The glacier looked wrong too. The ice was a strange blue-white color, almost glowing in places. And it was making sounds, not the usual creaking and settling you'd expect, but something that sounded almost like whispers. I found their base camp around noon. 3 tents, perfectly set up with all their gear neatly arranged. But everything was covered in a thin layer of frost, which made no sense in the July heat. I checked their food supplies. Still there. They're sleepy. And bags were laid out like they'd been planning to sleep, but hadn't used them. That's when I found the first sign that something was really wrong. Footprints leading away from camp toward the glacier. But these prints were weird. They started normal, but the deeper into the ice field they went, the more they looked like the people had been stumbling, then crawling. The trail led to a crack in the glacier I'd never seen before. It was narrow, but deep, maybe 8 feet wide and dropping down into darkness. Fresh rope was anchored at the edge, their rope. They'd gone down there. I should have called for backup right then, should have hiked back to where my radio could reach headquarters. But I kept thinking about 3 people who might be hurt and waiting for help. In rescue work, time is everything. I put on my climbing gear and started down into the crack. The temperature dropped fast as I descended. Within 50 feet, I couldn't see my breath anymore, not because it got warmer, but because the air itself seemed to be freezing. The ice walls around me were smooth, almost polished, like something had been moving through here regularly. About 100 feet down, the crack opened up into a cave. Not a natural ice cave, this one had been carved out with walls that curved in patterns that hurt to look at. And it was cold. Colder than anything I'd ever felt, even in winter storms above treeline. That's where I found Janet Morrison. She was standing against the far wall of the ice cave, perfectly upright like she was waiting for something. At first I thought she was alive, just very still. Then I got closer. Janet was frozen solid. Not just cold, completely encased in ice that had formed around her like a clear shell. Her eyes were wide open, staring at something deeper in the cave. Her face was locked in an expression of pure terror. But here's the thing that made my stomach drop. She wasn't wearing winter gear. She was in her regular climbing clothes, the same lightweight outfit you'd wear on a warm July day, and the ice around her wasn't rough and bumpy like you'd expect from a sudden freeze. It was smooth, almost artistic, like someone had carefully sculpted it around her body. I called out for Paul and Mike, but my voice just echoed back strange and wrong. The cave seemed to swallow sound and twisted into something else. I checked Janet for any signs of life, even though I knew it was hopeless. Her skin was blue-white and hard as stone. When I touched the ice around her arm, it burned my fingers with cold, even through my thick gloves. That's when I noticed the footprints leading deeper into the cave. The cave system was bigger than I'd expected, with tunnels branching off in several directions. The main passage sloped downward, and the walls were covered in formations that didn't look natural. They reminded me of the decorations you might see in an old church, but twisted and wrong somehow. I followed the footprints for maybe 200 yards before I found Paul Henderson. Unlike Janet, Paul was still alive, barely. He was sitting in a side chamber, huddled against the wall with his arms wrapped around his knees. When my flashlight beam hit him, he looked up with eyes that had seen too much. "Thank God," he whispered. His lips were blue, and he was shaking so hard I could hear his teeth chattering. I thought it was coming back. "Paul, it's Dan Stormcrow from Park Service. We've been looking for you." I immediately started pulling emergency warming supplies from my pack. "What happened? Where's Mike?" "Gone," Paul said. "It took him. Jesus Christ, it took him deeper." I wrapped him in my emergency blanket and activated a chemical hand warmer, pressing it against his chest. But it was like trying to warm up a block of ice. The cold was coming from inside him somehow. "Paul, I need you to focus. What took Mike? Was it an animal? A bear?" He started laughing then, a sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. "A bear? You think a bear did this?" He grabbed my arm with fingers that felt like ice picks. "It's old, Ranger, older than the mountains, and it's been sleeping in the deep. Ice, but now it's waking up." I tried to get more sense out of him, but he kept rambling about something that lived in the deepest part of the cave system. Something that had been frozen for thousands of years but was starting to move again because the ice was melting. "The cold isn't natural," he kept saying. "It doesn't come from the air. It comes from inside it. It steals the warmth right out of you, and when there's no warmth left, you freeze from the inside out." I got him to his feet and started leading him back toward the entrance. That was the plan. Get Paul out, then come back with a full rescue team to look for Mike. But Paul couldn't walk more than a few steps without collapsing. "Leave me," he said when we were maybe halfway back to Janet. "It's too late for me anyway. The cold is already inside." "Nobody gets left behind," I told him. "That's not how this works." But he was getting heavier and heavier, like the cold was turning his blood to ice. By the time we reached the chamber where Janet was frozen, I was practically carrying him. That's when we heard it. A sound from deeper in the cave. Not quite a roar, not quite a scream. Something that spoke of hunger and ancient anger and cold beyond imagination. The sound echoed through the ice tunnels and seemed to come from everywhere at once. Paul started shaking worse. "It knows we're here," he whispered. "It can smell the warmth." I was about to ask what he meant when I felt it myself, a coldness moving through the cave like a living thing. The temperature was dropping fast and ice was starting to form on the walls around us. "We need to get out. Now!" I half-carried, half-dragged Paul toward the rope I'd left hanging from the entrance crack. But with each step, he got heavier and colder. When we reached the bottom of the rope, his lips had turned completely blue, and his eyes were starting to glaze over. "Can't make it," he gasped. "Too cold. It's in my chest now." I rigged up a hasty rope system to haul him up, but halfway to the surface, Paul's body went completely rigid. He let out one final breath that came out as a cloud of ice crystals, and then he was still. I got his body to the surface and checked for a pulse. Nothing. His skin was cold as stone, and there was frost forming around his mouth and nose. But the weird thing was, it was nearly 80 degrees outside the cave. Paul Henderson had died of hypothermia in the middle of a July heat wave. I tried CPR, but it was like trying to bring back a statue. Whatever had killed him, it wasn't something that medical training could fix. I dragged his body back to their camp and used my radio to try calling for help, but I couldn't get a signal. The mountains were blocking everything. I was going to have to hike back to the ranger station to report what I'd found, but I couldn't stop thinking about Mike Torres, still down there in those ice tunnels with whatever had killed his friends. As the sun started to set, the temperature around the glacier began dropping fast. Not the normal mountain cooling you'd expect. This was different. Unnatural. I could see my breath again, and frost was forming on my gear. That's when I heard it for the second time. That sound from deep in the ice. Closer now, and hungrier. I made camp as far from the cave entrance as I could while still keeping watch on it. But even wrapped in my sleeping bag with a small campfire burning, I couldn't get warm. The cold seemed to be seeping up through the ground itself. Around midnight, I saw movement near the crack in the glacier. Something large and pale, moving with a strange, jerky motion like it was having trouble remembering how to walk. And I realized that whatever was down in those caves wasn't going to stay there much longer. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear that sound again, like wind through ice, but with an intelligence behind it that made my skin crawl. By dawn, frost had formed on. Everything in my camp, including the inside of my tent, the temperature gauge on my pack read 32 degrees. In July. At that elevation, it should have been at least 60. I knew I should have hiked back for help right then. But Mike Torres was still missing, and as a rescue specialist, I couldn't abandon him. Besides, in daylight, the cave didn't seem as threatening. Just a crack in the ice where 2 people had died from some kind of freak weather event. That's what I told myself anyway. I spent the morning preparing better equipment. More rope, stronger lights, chemical heat packs, even a small camping stove that I could use to warm the air around me. If I was going back down there, I wasn't going to freeze like the others. Before heading back into the cave, I hiked up to a high ridge where my radio might work. I managed to get a weak signal through to headquarters. "Base, this is Stormcrow. I found the climbing team. 2 are dead, 1 still missing. I need a full rescue team and medical support." Static crackled back at me, then Chief Williams' voice. "Dan, what's your status? The Weather Service is showing some crazy readings from your area." "That's part of the problem," I said. "We've got some kind of extreme cold zone around the glacier. Paul Henderson died of hypothermia in 80-degree weather." Long pause. "Say that again?" "Hypothermia. In summer. Bill, there's something wrong with this whole area. The ice is behaving strangely, and the temperature readings don't make sense. Dan, I'm sending a team, but it'll take them 2 days to reach your position. Can you hold out?" I looked back down at the glacier, where that unnatural cold was already starting to build again. "I'll manage. But Bill, you might want to contact the tribal council. Ask them about the old stories regarding Grinnell Glacier." Another pause. "You think this is connected to—" "I don't know what I think anymore. Just ask them." The signal cut out after that, and I couldn't raise them again. I went back to camp and spent an hour psyching myself up for another descent into the cave. The entrance crack looked different in daylight, wider somehow, and the edges of the ice around it were smoother, like something large had been moving in and out. This time, I brought 3 powerful LED lights and enough batteries to keep them running for days. I also rigged up a safety line that I could follow back to the surface, even if my lights failed. The descent was easier the second time, but the cold hit me harder. Even with all my preparation, by the time I reached the bottom, I was shivering despite the warming packs taped to my chest and back. Janet Morrison was still there, frozen in her shell of ice. But something had changed. The ice around her was thicker, more elaborate, and her position was different. Her head was turned slightly, like she was watching the deeper tunnels. I followed the passage where I'd lost Paul the day before, but this time I kept going. The cave system was much larger than I'd realized, with chambers branching off in all directions. Some of them had been carved out with tools, while others looked natural. But all of them were covered in that strange, smooth ice. In one chamber, I found Mike Torres' climbing gear, his backpack, his ropes, his helmet, all neatly arranged on a ledge like someone had been taking inventory. But no Mike. The gear was covered in the same unnatural ice as everything else in the cave. When I tried to pick up his helmet, it cracked apart in my hands like it had been frozen for years instead of days. That's when I saw the claw marks. They were scratched into the ice wall, 5 parallel gouges about 8 inches long and 2 inches deep. But these weren't bear claws or anything else I recognized, the poo. I were too long, too precise, and they seemed to have been made by something that was part ice itself. Below the claw marks, written in the frost on the cave floor, were words. It wakes. Not carved or scratched. Written, like someone had used their finger to trace letters in ice crystals. The writing was fresh. I called out for Mike, even though I was pretty sure by then that he wasn't going to answer. My voice echoed back from the deeper tunnels, but there was something else mixed in with the echo, a sound like breathing, but slower and deeper than anything human. That's when I found the main chamber. The passage opened up into a huge cavern, maybe 100 feet across and twice as high. The walls were covered in ice formations that definitely weren't natural. They looked like frozen waterfalls, but arranged in patterns that reminded me of cathedral architecture. And in the center of the chamber, embedded in a massive block of ice, was something that made me forget how to breathe. At first glance, it looked almost human. 9 feet tall, with a basically human shape, head, arms, legs, torso. But as I got closer with my lights, I could see the differences. The proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, with too many joints. The fingers ended in claws like black icicles. The head was elongated, with a face that was all angles and sharp edges. And its skin, if you could call it skin, was translucent, showing dark shapes moving underneath that might have been organs or might have been something worse. But the eyes were the worst part. They were open, staring out through the ice with an intelligence that was ancient and hungry and completely alien. Even frozen solid, those eyes seemed to be watching me. Around the base of the ice block, I found what was left of Mike Torres. Not his body. That was gone. But his clothes were there, arranged in a perfect circle around the creature like some kind of offering. They were frozen solid and covered in frost, but there was no blood, no signs of violence. It was like Mike had simply vanished out of his clothes. Uths. I was backing away from the ice block, trying to process what I was seeing, when I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice water. A crack. A single, sharp crack from the block of ice, holding the creature. I spun around and saw a hairline fracture running down one side of the ice. As I watched, it spread a little further, and I could swear the creature's eyes moved to track my movement. Another crack, this one louder. The ice was melting. Not from any heat source I could see. The chamber was still cold enough to freeze my breath. But somehow, the ancient ice that had held this thing prisoner was failing. I ran. I ran through the cave system, following my safety line, not caring about anything except putting distance between myself and that thing in the ice. Behind me, I could hear more cracking sounds, getting faster and louder. When I reached the chamber where Janet was frozen, I paused to catch my breath and check my gear. That pause saved my life because it let me hear the sound coming from the main chamber. Ice hitting stone, lots of ice, and underneath that, a roar that shook the entire cave system. It was free. I made it to the rope and started climbing toward the surface as fast as I could. Halfway up, the sound changed. Now it was footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps moving through the cave below me. And they were getting closer. I burst out of the crack in the glacier and immediately started pulling up my rope. Whatever was down there, I wasn't going to make it easy for it to follow me. But I was too late. As the last of my rope came up, a hand shot out of the crack. Not a human hand. This one was gray-white like old ice, with fingers that were too long and claws that could have torn through steel. It grabbed the edge of the crack and pulled. The creature hauled itself out of the glacier like it was climbing out of a swimming pool in the afternoon sunlight. It was even more terrifying than it had been in the cave. Its translucent skin showed dark shapes moving underneath, and its eyes were like looking into the heart of a winter storm. But the worst part was the cold that came with it. The temperature around the glacier dropped 30 degrees in seconds. The grass around the crack turned brown and brittle. Ice began forming on the rocks. The creature stood up to its full 9-foot height and looked around like it was remembering where it was. Then those winter storm eyes focused on me. It smiled. I had enough time to see that its teeth were made of ice before I turned and ran for my life. The creature didn't chase me right away. When I looked back after a few hundred yards, it was still standing by the crack in the glacier, testing its movements like it was learning how to use its body again. But the cold was spreading outward from where it stood, killing everything it touched. I made it back to base camp and started throwing my gear together. Whatever this thing was, it was beyond anything I could handle alone. I needed to get back to headquarters, get a team together, maybe even call in the military. But as I was stuffing my sleeping bag into my pack, I remembered something my grandmother had told me about the hungry cold ones. They didn't just kill people, they followed them. Once they had your scent, your warmth, they would track you anywhere, and they got stronger with every life they took. If I led this thing back to the populated areas of the park, it would be a massacre. I was still trying to figure out what to do when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate footsteps that crunched through the grass like someone walking on fresh snow. I turned around and there it was, 50 feet away and approaching steadily. Up close, I could see that its body wasn't quite solid. Parts of it seemed to be made of flowing ice that shifted and changed as it moved, and the cold coming off it was like standing in front of an open freezer. "You woke me," it said. Its voice was like wind through a queue, emissary, hollow and cold and full of ancient anger. The words came out as visible puffs of ice crystals that hung in the air before drifting to the ground. "Your kind always wakes me, always digging, always exploring, always so curious about things that should stay buried." It stopped walking and tilted its head to one side. "The last ones who found me were different, darker skin like yours. They knew enough to leave me alone." I realized it was talking about my people, the Blackfeet who had lived in this area for centuries. They'd known about this thing and had kept others away from its resting place. "But you're different," the creature continued. "You have their blood, but you think like the others. You don't believe in the old warnings." I tried to back away, but the cold was getting stronger. Ice was forming on my boots, making it hard to move. "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted. Warmth, life, the heat that flows through living things." It took another step closer. I was so hungry when I went to sleep, and now I'm even hungrier. That's when I understood what had happened to Mike Torres. This thing didn't just kill people. It absorbed them, took their life force to feed itself, and the more it fed, the stronger it became. "I can give you warmth," I said, playing for time while I tried to think of a plan. "There are towns full of people not far from here." It laughed, a sound like icicles breaking. "Oh, I know. I can smell them already. Thousands of warm, living things just waiting to feed me. But first, I need to deal with the one who woke me." The creature raised one clawed hand, and I felt the temperature around me drop even further. Ice began forming on my jacket, on my skin, in my lungs. This was how Paul Henderson had died, frozen from the inside out. But as the cold closed in around me, I remembered something else from my grandmother's story. Yes, the hungry cold ones were creatures of ice and winter, but they had one weakness. They couldn't survive extreme heat. I still had the camping stove in my pack along with a canister of fuel. Not much, but maybe enough. Fighting against the cold that was turning my muscles to stone, I managed to pull out the stove and flip the fuel valve wide open. Gas hissed out in a thick stream, and I triggered the ignition. The flame that shot out was small, but in the frigid air around the creature, it might as well have been a blowtorch. The thing shrieked and stepped back as the heat washed over it. "Fire!" it hissed. Clever little warm thing. But the stove wouldn't last long, and when it ran out, I'd be defenseless. I needed something bigger. That's when I remembered the emergency flares in my rescue kit. I dropped the stove and grabbed 2 road flares from my pack. These things burned at over 3,000 degrees, hot enough to melt steel. If heat could hurt this creature, these should be able to do some serious damage. I ignited the first flare and held it out like a weapon. The creature hissed and backed away further, and I could see places where its ice body was starting to melt and steam. "Stay back," I shouted, advancing with the flare. "I've got more of these." But the creature was learning. Instead of backing away further, it began circling me, looking for an opening. And I realized that my flares wouldn't last forever either. I needed a permanent solution. Looking around desperately, I saw something that might work. About 200 yards upslope from where we were standing, there was a steep section of glacier that looked unstable. If I could trigger an avalanche, I might be able to bury this thing again, but I'd have to get close to the glacier face to do it, and that meant getting past the creature. I lit the second flare and threw it directly at the thing's center mass. It shrieked and stumbled backwards, clawing at the places where the burning chemicals had splashed across its ice body. That gave me the opening I needed. I ran toward the glacier, hauling out the last items in my emergency kit that might help. 3 thermite charges that I carried for extreme rescue situations. Normally, I'd use them to cut through metal wreckage to reach trapped victims. Today, I was going to use them to bring down a mountain. The creature recovered quickly and came after me, but the damage from the flares had slowed it down. Parts of its body were still melting and reforming as it moved. I reached the base of the unstable glacier section and started placing the thermite charges in strategic spots. These things burned at nearly 4,000 degrees and would melt through ice like it was butter. "You cannot stop me," the creature called out. It was maybe 30 yards away now and closing fast. "I am older than your mountains. I was here when the world was young and cold." "Maybe," I said, arming the first charge. "But you've been asleep for a long time. Things have changed." I triggered all 3 charges at once. The thermite ignited with a roar like a jet engine, sending jets of molten metal deep into the glacier. The ice began to crack and groan, and I could hear the rumble of tons of snow and ice starting to shift above us. The creature looked up just as the avalanche began. "No," it said, and for the first time there was fear in that hollow voice. Not again. Not back to the cold sleep. But it was too late. Thousands of tons of ice and snow came thundering down the mountainside, burying everything in their path. I had maybe 3 seconds to throw myself behind a large boulder before the wave hit. The world went white and cold and loud. Then everything was quiet. When I dug myself out of the snow 3 hours later, my left arm was broken, and I had frostbite on my fingers that would leave permanent scars. But I was alive, which was more than I'd expected. The avalanche had completely reshaped the glacier. Where the creature had urged from the ice crack, there was now a solid wall of snow and broken ice 40 feet thick. If the thing was still down there, it would take more than a summer heat wave to wake it up. Again, I made my way back to what was left of the base camp and managed to get my emergency beacon working. The rescue team found me 2 days later, half dead from exposure and babbling about ice demons. The official report listed Janet Morrison and Paul Henderson as victims of hypothermia caused by unexpected weather conditions. Mike Torres was classified as missing, presumed dead in a crevasse fall. The entire area around Grinnell Glacier was quietly closed to climbing indefinitely. I spent 6 weeks in the hospital recovering from frostbite and what the doctors called severe psychological trauma related to extreme survival conditions. They wanted to keep me longer for observation, but I convinced them I was fine. I wasn't fine. I requested a transfer as soon as I was cleared for duty. Chief Williams tried to talk me out of it, but I told him I needed a change of scenery. He arranged for me to take a position at Death Valley National Park, the hottest, driest place they could find. Even there, in 120-degree heat, I sometimes wake up cold. I never told anyone the complete truth about what happened on the glacier. The official reports mention unusual weather patterns and possible seismic activity, but they don't mention 9-foot ice creatures or ancient demons. Nobody would believe that anyway. But I did make sure to have several conversations with the tribal council about the old warnings. They weren't surprised to hear that the hungry cold ones were stirring again. The ice is melting faster now, Elder Joseph Standing Bear told me. Global warming, they call it. But some ice was never meant to melt. He gave me a medicine bundle to carry and taught me prayers that his grandfather had used to ward off the winter spirits. I still carry that bundle, and I still say those prayers, even though I'm not sure I believe they'll help if I ever meet another one of the sea things. Because here's what keeps me awake at night. I triggered that avalanche in July of 1988. It's been 35 years since then, and the glaciers keep shrinking every summer. What if I didn't kill that thing? What if I just buried it again? And what if there are others? Last month, I got a call from a park ranger in Alaska. They'd found some climbers near a glacier, all dead from hypothermia in summer weather. The bodies were arranged in a circle around something that had melted out of the ice, something that left claw marks in the stone. I told him to close the area and call the tribal councils. I told him to bring fire. I don't know if he listened. The thing is, my grandmother's stories weren't just about creatures that slept in the ice. They were warnings about what would happen when the ice started to disappear. When the world got warmer and the ancient cold places began to thaw. She used to say that the hungry cold ones were put to sleep for a reason. They were locked away until the world could forget about them, until people stopped believing in things that lived in the deep ice. But forgetting something and making it go away aren't the same thing. Climate change isn't just about rising sea levels and changing weather patterns. It's about uncovering things that were buried for good reasons, things that our ancestors knew enough to leave alone. Every summer, more glaciers melt, more ancient ice disappears, more sleeping things wake up hungry. I'm 63 years old now, too old to be climbing glaciers and fighting demons, but I keep my emergency kit ready, just in case. Flares, thermite charges, everything I used that day in Montana, because someday someone else is going to call and say they found climbers dead from hypothermia in summer weather. And when that happens, I'll have to decide whether to tell them about the hungry cold ones, or whether to pack my gear and go hunting one more time. Either way, I won't be surprised. The old stories were true. They were always true. We just forgot how to listen. My name is Thomas Brightfeather, and I need to tell you what really happened at the medicine wheel in August 1988. The official reports say it was altitude sickness that made me see things that weren't there. They're wrong, dead wrong. I've been a park ranger for 12 years now, protecting the sacred sites in Bighorn National Forest. The medicine wheel sits at 9,642 feet, a circle of stones laid out by my ancestors centuries ago. 28 spokes radiating from the center, each one marking something important, star positions, sacred directions, things most people don't understand anymore. My grandmother used to tell stories about that place, dark stories. She'd grab my wrist with her weathered hands and whisper warnings about disturbing sacred ground, about things that sleep beneath the stones. Skinwalkers, she called them, shapeshifters that could wear any face they wanted. I never believed her. At 38, I figured I was smart enough to separate fact from superstition. I had a college degree, 12 years of ranger training, and a healthy respect for science. Skinwalkers were Navajo legends anyway, not Crow. My job was protecting archaeological sites from vandals and treasure hunters, not chasing ghost stories. The morning of August 15th started like any other. Radio check at 6 a.m., patrol route planned by 6:30. The summer tourist season was winding down, but we still got our share of problems. Teenagers spray painting rocks, New Age types trying to hold ceremonies they didn't understand, occasional idiots with metal detectors. My supervisor's voice crackled through the radio as I loaded my truck. "Tommy, we got another vandalism report up at the wheel. College kids again, looks like." I sighed, checking my gear. Pepper spray, first aid kit, camera for evidence photos. "What kind of damage this time, Chief?" "Anonymous tip says they found cool stuff. Animal remains, maybe. Better get up there and document everything before the weather turns." The drive up took 45 minutes on winding mountain roads. No cell service once you got above 8,000 feet. Just you, the mountains, and whatever was waiting up there. I'd made this trip hundreds of times, knew every switchback and overlook. The alpine meadows stretched out green and peaceful, dotted with wildflowers that would be dead in a month when the first snow came. But something felt different that morning. The air was too still, like the mountains were holding their breath. Even the marmots that usually chattered from the rocks stayed quiet. I told myself it was just the weather, a storm system moving in from the west, making the animals nervous. The Medicine Wheel parking area was empty except for tire tracks in the dirt, fresh ones from the night before. I grabbed my camera and hiked the quarter-mile trail to the site, breathing hard in the thin air. The stone circle came into view, and my heart sank. They'd built their own circle inside the sacred one. Black candles melted down to stumps, strange symbols scratched in the dirt, and in the center. I had to turn away and take a few deep breaths before I could look again. Dead animals. A rabbit, a squirrel, something that might have been a hawk. All arranged in a pattern I didn't recognize. Their throats cut clean. The blood had soaked into the earth, turning it dark and sticky. Worst of all, they'd stolen artifacts from the visitor center, pottery shards, arrowheads, things that belonged in a museum, not scattered around some college kid's idea of a ritual. I started taking photos, trying to stay professional, document everything, file the report, let the FBI handle the cultural resource violations. But my hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold mountain air. My grandmother's voice echoed in my head. "Some doors should never be opened, Tommy. Some things should stay buried." The wind picked up, carrying a smell I couldn't identify, sweet and rotten at the same time, like flowers left too long in a grave. I finished my photos and started gathering the stolen artifacts, careful not to disturb the crime scene any more than necessary. That's when I found the journal, black leather cover stuffed with photocopied pages and handwritten notes. The writing was messy, excited, like someone had been working in a hurry. I flipped through it, my stomach getting tighter with each page. Day 3. The binding ritual worked better than expected. Something definitely responded. Day 7. Sarah thinks we made contact. The dreams are getting stronger. Day 12. Found the real invocation in the university library archives. Tonight we complete the summoning. The last entry was dated 3 days ago. Below it, someone had drawn the same symbols I'd seen scratched around the ritual circle, symbols I'd never seen before, but that somehow felt familiar, like genetic memory screaming warnings I couldn't quite understand. I was still reading when I heard footsteps on the trail behind me. Sir, are you the ranger?" I turned around, slipping the journal into my jacket. A young woman stood at the edge of the stone circle, maybe 20 years old, with the kind of healthy tan that said money and leisure time. College student, definitely. Her hiking boots were too new. Her outdoor gear still had price tags. "I'm Ranger Brightfeather," I said. "You shouldn't be up here alone, miss. This is a crime scene." She laughed, but it came out shaky. "Crime scene? What happened?" I gestured at the ritual circle. "Someone decided to play with things they don't understand. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Her face went pale. Oh God. They actually went through with it." "They?" "My friends, my boyfriend, Derek, and his roommate, Mike. They've been obsessed with this occult stuff all summer. Said they found some ancient ritual that would let them contact spirits." She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the warm afternoon sun. "I told them it was stupid. I told them not to mess around up here. What's your name? Jennifer Walsh. I'm a student at University of Wyoming. Derek was supposed to pick me up this morning. We had plans to go hiking, but he never showed up and his roommate won't answer his phone. The way she said "was" made my chest tight. When did you last see Derek? 2 nights ago. He was all excited about finally doing the ritual. Said they'd been preparing for weeks, learning the proper invocations, gathering the right materials. She looked at the dead animals and shuddered. I didn't think they'd actually heard anything. I pulled out my notebook. I'm going to need Derek's full name and address, his roommates too, and I need you to tell me everything you know about what they were doing up here. Jennifer told me about Derek Patterson and Mike Summers, both 21, both anthropology majors with too much time and too little sense. They'd been researching Native American spiritual practices for a summer project, but somewhere along the way, they'd gotten obsessed with what Derek called real magic. They'd found references to something called a shadow caller ritual in an old missionary's journal from the 1800s. Derek said the missionary wrote about witnessing a Crow shaman summon a spirit that could take any form it wanted. The missionary called it demonic, but Derek thought it was just cultural misunderstanding. Jennifer's voice dropped to a whisper. He wanted to prove that native spiritual practices were real, not just superstition. My blood ran cold. I'd heard that story before, around campfires when I was young. The shadow caller wasn't a spirit you summoned. It was something that already existed, something ancient and hungry that waited for fools to cant while its name. Jennifer, I need you to go back to town right now. Don't stop, don't talk to anyone. Just get in your car and drive. But what about Derek? What if he's hurt? Before I could answer, my radio crackled to life. Static, then a voice I didn't recognize. Ranger, help, something's wrong. Can't find the trail. I grabbed the handset. This is Ranger Brightfeather. Who is this? What's your location? More static, then clearer. Derek Patterson. I think I'm lost. Everything looks different up here. Jennifer gasped. That's him. That's Derek's voice. But something about the transmission made my skin crawl. The voice was right, but the cadence was wrong. Too slow, like someone learning to speak for the first time. Derek, this is the Ranger. I need you to stay calm and tell me exactly where you are. Long pause. Then, I'm at the medicine wheel, but it's not how it should be. The stones are moving, Ranger. They're moving in circles, and there's something inside them. I looked at the stone circle in front of me. Nothing was moving. The ancient rocks sat exactly where they'd sat for centuries. Derek, I'm at the medicine wheel right now. I don't see you. Are you sure of your location? Another pause. When the voice came back, it was different, happier. Oh, I see you now, Ranger. You're standing right there by the circle. I can see you perfectly. Jennifer grabbed my arm. He's not here. Derek's not here. I scanned the area around us. Empty alpine meadows stretching in all directions, nowhere for someone to hide. But the voice on the radio sounded so certain. Derek, I need you to wave to me so I can see where you are. I'm waving right now, Ranger. I'm waving right at you. Can't you see me? The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. My breath came out in white puffs, and frost began forming on the radio handset. Jennifer's teeth started chattering. Something's wrong, she whispered. Something's really wrong. That's when I saw the footprints, fresh tracks in the soft earth, around the ritual circle made by hiking boots. They started at the edge of the stone circle and spiraled inward, getting deeper and more pronounced as they approached the center. But they didn't spiral back out. They just stopped. Right in the middle of the circle, the prints ended abruptly, like whoever made them had simply vanished into thin air, or been pulled down into the earth itself. My radio crackled again. Ranger, why aren't you answering me? I can see you talking to that girl, but you won't look at me. I'm standing right in front of you. I keyed the mic with trembling fingers. Derek, I need you to describe what I'm wearing. Green uniform, badge on your chest, dark hair under your ranger hat. You look scared, Ranger. Why do you look so scared? He was right about everything. but there was no one there. Jennifer started backing away from the stone circle. We need to leave. We need to leave right now. Derek, I want you to walk toward the parking area. Can you do that for me? But I'm already here with you. We're talking right now. Why do you want me to walk away from you? The voice was getting frustrated, petulant, like a child who couldn't understand why the adults weren't playing along with its game. I grabbed Jennifer's arm. We're leaving. Now. As we hurried back toward the trail, my radio squawked one more time. Ranger? Ranger, where are you going? Don't leave me here alone. There's something else up here with me. Something that smells like old bones and bad dreams. Ranger, it's wearing your face. The transmission cut to static. We ran. By the time we reached my truck, Jennifer was hyperventilating. I had her sit on the tailgate while I called for backup on the vehicle radio, the only communication that worked this high up. Dispatch, this is Brightfeather. I need a search and rescue team at the Medicine Wheel site. We have a missing person, male, early 20s. Copy that, Tommy. What's the situation? I looked at Jennifer, who was still shaking. How do you explain that you've been talking to someone who might not exist? Vandalism investigation turned into something bigger. I'll brief the team when they arrive. ETA 40 minutes. Weather Service says a storm's moving in fast, so make it quick. 40 minutes. I turned back to Jennifer. I need you to tell me everything else you know about this ritual Derek was planning. Everything. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. There were 3 of them involved, Derek, Mike, and a girl named Sarah Chen. They'd been meeting in secret for weeks, practicing what Derek called preparatory ceremonies. What kind of preparations? Fasting, meditation. Derek said they had to purify themselves before attempting contact. He showed me some of the research, photocopies from old books, translated Native American prayers, stuff like that. She shuddered. Some of it was really disturbing. Descriptions of spirits that could steal people's shapes, wear their faces like masks. My grandmother's warnings echoed in my head again. The shadow caller wasn't something you summoned. It was something that had always been here, sleeping beneath sacred ground, waiting for someone foolish enough to wake it up. Did they ever mention finding actual remains? Bodies, bones, anything like that? Jennifer nodded. Derek said they'd discovered a burial site about a mile east of the Medicine Wheel, some kind of ancient grave that wasn't on any of the archaeological maps. He was excited because he thought it proved the area had more spiritual significance than anyone realized. A burial site. Of course. The Shadow Caller legend said the creature had once been human, a powerful shaman who'd made a deal with dark spirits for immortality. When the tribe discovered what he'd become, they'd killed his physical body and buried it with specific rituals to keep his spirit trapped. But if someone disturbed that burial... Jenny, I need you to drive down to town and call the FBI. Tell them we have a cultural resource violation and possible grave robbery. Give them Derek's information and tell them to put out a BOLO alert. What about you? I'm going to wait for search and rescue and then find this burial site. She grabbed my arm. Don't. Please don't go looking for it alone. Something's wrong up here. Something really wrong. You heard that radio transmission. That wasn't Derek. I knew she was right. The voice on the radio had been learning, adapting, trying to mimic human speech patterns, but not quite getting it right. Like something wearing a Derek-shaped mask, but not understanding how Derek actually talked. I'll be careful, I lied. Just get to town and make those calls. After Jennifer left, I sat in my truck and tried to make sense of what I'd experienced. Rational explanations kept slipping away like water through my fingers. Atmospheric disturbance causing radio interference. Altitude sickness making me hallucinate footprints. Stress-induced paranoia making normal sounds seem threatening. But my grandmother's voice wouldn't be silenced. The shadow caller feeds on disbelief, Tommy. The more you deny it, the stronger it becomes. 20 minutes later, the search and rescue team arrived. 4 experienced mountain rescue specialists led by Maria Santos, a woman I'd worked with dozens of times. Good people, competent people, people who deserve to know what they might be walking into. What's the situation, Tommy? Maria asked as her team geared up. I showed them the ritual circle, explained about the missing students, played the radio transmission. They listened with the professional skepticism of people who'd seen every kind of human stupidity the mountains could produce. "Sounds like college kids playing with things they don't understand," said Pete, the team's tracker. "Probably got spooked by their own doctor, a Maddox, and wandered off trail in the dark." "Maybe," I said, "but there's something else you need to know." I told them about the burial site, about the possibility that the students had disturbed more than just the medicine wheel. Maria's expression grew serious. "Grave robbery changes things. If they disturbed human remains, we're looking at federal charges." She studied the topographical map. "You know this area better than anyone. Where would they have found a burial site that's not on the archaeological surveys?" I thought about the old stories, the traditional burial practices of my ancestors. Sacred sites were often placed on high ground with clear sight lines protected by natural barriers. East Ridge, probably. There are some caves up there that were used for ceremonial purposes. We set out at 4 p.m., following game trails through increasingly rough terrain. The storm clouds were building fast, and the temperature was dropping. In the mountains, weather could turn deadly in minutes. Pete found the burial site first. "Over here," he called, voice tight with professional concern. It was worse than I'd feared. They'd completely excavated what had once been a traditional burial chamber, scattering bones and grave goods across a wide area. Ancient pottery lay smashed among the rocks. Bone tools that should have been handled by archaeologists with proper training had been tossed aside like trash. But it was the arrangement of the human remains that made my blood freeze. The skeleton had been reassembled in the center of a ritual circle, surrounded by the same symbols I'd seen at the medicine wheel. But this wasn't random desecration. Someone had known exactly how to position the bones, which direction they should face, what offerings to place at the cardinal points. Someone had been trying to resurrect whatever had been buried here. "Jesus," whispered Maria. "How old is this burial?" I knelt beside the skull, careful not to disturb anything further. The bone was stained dark with age, and the teeth showed the wear patterns of a pre-contact Native American. But there was something wrong with the skeleton itself. The bones were too long, the joints positioned at impossible angles. Even accounting for decay and displacement, this person had been different. "At least 400 years, I said. "Maybe older." That's when we heard the screaming, high-pitched, full of terror, coming from somewhere below us in the valley. Human screaming, but with something wrong about it. Too long, too loud, like someone with extra lung capacity. "That came from the direction of the medicine wheel," Pete said, pulling out his radio. Static answered him. Then a voice I recognized. "Help. Help me. I'm trapped in the stones. They're closing in." It was the same voice from my earlier transmission. The one claiming to be Derek. Maria grabbed her radio. "Derek, this is search and rescue. What's your exact position?" "I'm inside the circle. Inside the medicine wheel. But it's not the same one. The stones are alive and they're moving." The voice was getting clearer, more natural. Learning. Pete was already heading back down the trail. "I'm going to check it out." "Wait," I called. "We should stay together." But Pete was already gone, crashing through the brush with the confidence of someone who'd spent 20 years rescuing people from these mountains. Maria and the other 2 team members followed, leaving me alone with the disturbed burial. I should have gone with them, should have insisted we all stay together. But something made me linger, staring down at the reassembled skeleton. The way the bones were positioned reminded me of something, a half-remembered story my grandmother used to tell. The shadow caller had been buried in a special way, she'd said. Bones arranged to trap the spirit, weighted down with sacred stones, surrounded by prayers carved in the earth itself. But if someone ever disturbed that arrangement, and if they ever tried to put the bones back together, the spirit would be free to wear any shape it chose. Pete's screaming cut through the evening air like a knife. Not calling for help, not shouting directions, screaming in pure animal terror, the sound of someone seeing something that broke their mind. The screaming stopped abruptly. My radio crackled. "Ranger Brightfeather, this is Pete. I found the missing student. He's hurt pretty bad, but I think we can get him out. Can you bring the medical kit down to the medicine wheel? Pete's voice. Pete's calm, professional tone. But Pete didn't know my last name was Brightfeather. I'd never told him, and it wasn't on my uniform. Pete, what's your exact location? Right where you left me, Tommy, at the medicine wheel. Why are you asking strange questions? I felt cold certainty settle in my stomach. The thing in the burial chamber wasn't just wearing Derek's voice anymore. It had Pete now, too. I ran back toward the medicine wheel, but not to help. To warn Maria and the others, if it wasn't already too late. The trail seemed longer than before, the shadows deeper. Every tree could hide something wearing a familiar face. Every sound could be another person the shadow caller had learned to imitate. The storm hit just as I reached the stone circle. Rain turned to sleet in minutes, then to snow. Visibility dropped to 20 feet. The temperature plummeted below freezing, and the wind howled through the ancient stones like the voices of the dead. I found Maria first. She was standing in the center of the ritual circle, perfectly still despite the howling blizzard. Her back was to me, but something about her posture was wrong. Too rigid, too perfect. Maria, I called. She turned around slowly, and I saw that her face was completely blank. No expression at all, like a mannequin that had never learned to be human. Hello, Thomas, she said in Maria's voice. I've been waiting for you. I backed away, reaching for my radio. Where's the real Maria? I am Maria. I am Pete. I am Derek. The thing wearing Maria's face smiled, but the expression never reached her eyes. I am everyone I need to be. You're the shadow caller. The smile widened. Such an ugly name. I prefer to think of myself as adaptive. Behind Maria, I could see shapes moving in the snow. Pete, Derek, even Jennifer, all standing perfectly still around the stone circle, all wearing the same blank expression. Your friends were so helpful, the shadow caller continued. They taught me so much about being human, how to speak, how to move, how to make the sounds that mean fear and pain and desperation. It gestured at the figures surrounding us. But I think I like your shape best, Thomas. You know these mountains. You understand the old ways. You would make a perfect vessel. The thing began to change. Maria's face melted like wax, features flowing and reshaping themselves. Her body stretched and contracted, bones popping audibly as they shifted into new configurations. In seconds, I was looking at a perfect copy of myself. Same face, same uniform, same scars from 20 years of mountain rescue work. Much better, it said in my voice. Now we can really talk. I pulled out my grandmother's sage bundle, the one I'd carried for 12 years but never used. My hands shook as I lit it with my emergency lighter. The shadow caller laughed. Superstition, Thomas. You're a modern man. You don't believe in any of that. But as the sacred smoke began to rise, the thing wearing my face took a step backward. I am Thomas Brightfeather, I said, words my grandmother had taught me echoing across the stone circle. Son of Mary Brightfeather, grandson of Agnes Wise Woman. I speak with the voice of my ancestors, and I command you to return to the earth. The shadow caller hissed, its perfect human facade beginning to slip. You can't banish me. I am free. The bonds are broken. The bonds were never broken. They were just sleeping. I began to walk around the stone circle, holding the burning sage high. The ancient crow prayers came back to me, words I'd learned as a child and forgotten as an adult. Each step felt like moving through deep water, each word like lifting enormous weight. But with every prayer, the shadow caller grew smaller. You don't understand, it snarled, no longer bothering to maintain human appearance. Its true form was a writhing mass of shadow and borrowed faces, constantly shifting between all the people it had consumed. I am eternal. I am hunger. I am the dark that lives in every human heart. You're a parasite, I said, and parasites die when they lose their host. I reached into my jacket and pulled out Derek's journal, the one I'd found at the original ritual site. The pages fluttered in the wind as I held it over the burning sage. They called you with ritual and sacrifice. But ritual works both ways. I dropped the journal into the flames. The shadow caller screamed, a sound like breaking glass and tearing metal. The possessed figures around the circle collapsed as if their strings had been cut. The thing in the center began to shrink, to condense, to be pulled back toward whatever dark place it had escaped from. "This isn't over," it whispered as it faded. "There will be others. There will always be others who want to play with powers they don't understand." Then it was gone. The snow stopped. The wind died. The temperature began to rise. I ran to Maria first, checking for a pulse. Weak, but steady. Pete was unconscious, but breathing. The shapes I'd thought were Derek and Jennifer turned out to be more search and rescue team members I hadn't seen arrive. All alive, all gradually waking up from whatever trance had held them. But of Derek Patterson and his friends, I found no trace except for 3 sets of footprints that led into the stone circle and simply stopped. The official report listed the incident as a case of severe altitude sickness causing mass hallucinations. The 3 missing college students were presumed to have fallen into a crevasse during the freak snowstorm. Their bodies were never recovered. Maria and her team remembered nothing after arriving at the burial site. The FBI investigated the grave robbery but couldn't find enough evidence to press charges against anyone. The disturbed remains were quietly reburied with proper ceremony, and the site was declared off-limits to the public. I requested a transfer to a lower elevation post the next month. Told my supervisor the thin air was getting to me, making me see things that weren't there. He understood. High-altitude psychology was a recognized problem in mountain rescue work. But that's not why I left. I left because sometimes, late at night, I still hear voices on my radio. Familiar voices calling for help, asking me to come up to the medicine wheel just one more time. The voices sound so real, so desperate. They know exactly what to say to make me want to respond. I've learned to turn the radio off after sunset. The new burial site has never been disturbed again as far as I know. But every year I get reports from other rangers, other parks, other sacred places where someone decided to play with forces beyond their understanding. College students mostly, sometimes New Age spiritual seekers, occasionally government archaeologists who think ancient burial sites are just historical curiosities. Most of the time, nothing happens. The rituals are wrong, the invocations incomplete. The old spirits stay asleep, but not always. 3 months ago, I got a call from a ranger in Mesa Verde. They'd found a ritual site, dead animals arranged in patterns, ancient pottery scattered around like trash, and footprints leading into the ceremonial chamber that never led back out. "We keep hearing voices on the radio," the ranger told me. "People claiming to be the missing researchers. But when we go to their last known location, there's nobody there." So, I told him about sage bundles and traditional prayers, about respecting sacred ground and understanding that some doors should never be opened. He listened politely, but I could hear the skepticism in his voice. He was a modern man with a college education and 20 years of law enforcement experience. He didn't believe in ancient curses or shape-shifting spirits. Neither did I once. That was 6 weeks ago. The ranger stopped answering his phone 2 weeks later. The official report blamed a climbing accident. If you ever find yourself working in or visiting places that were sacred to the original inhabitants of this land, remember this. Respect is more than just following posted signs and staying on marked trails. True respect means understanding that there are forces in this world older and more powerful than anything our modern lives have prepared us to face. Some places are sacred because they're beautiful. Others are sacred because they're dangerous. And sometimes, if you're very unlucky, you can't tell the difference until it's too late. The medicine wheel is still there, still drawing visitors who come to experience ancient Native American spirituality. The interpretive signs talk about astronomical alignments and ceremonial practices. They don't mention the shadow caller or the burial chamber or what happens when people try to contact spirits they don't understand. They don't mention that some of those spirits are still listening, still waiting for the next group of curious college students to find an old journal, light some candles, and speak words that should never be spoken. Still hungry. My grandmother was right about everything. The old stories aren't metaphors or cultural artifacts. They're warnings passed down through generations of people who understood that respect for sacred places isn't about political correctness or cultural sensitivity. It's about survival. I carry sage bundles now wherever I go. Even though my new assignment is in the desert where the biggest threat is supposed to be rattlesnakes and heat exhaustion. I know the traditional prayers in 3 different tribal languages. And I never, ever investigate reports of ritual activity without backup, daylight, and a clear exit strategy. Because somewhere out there, the shadow caller is still waiting. Maybe trapped again. Maybe still free and learning new faces to wear. Either way, it knows my name now. It knows my voice. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the desert at night, I catch myself wondering, if I heard my own voice calling for help on the radio, would I be able to resist answering? I hope I never have to find out. The shadows are growing longer now, and the sun is setting over the mountains. Time to turn off the radio and lock the doors. Time to burn a little sage and say the prayers my grandmother taught me. Time to remember that some warnings are worth listening to, even if you spent half your life thinking they were just stories. Especially then. My name is Elizabeth Thornfield, and I've been a forest ranger for 19 years. I've seen bears tear apart campsites, watched wolves hunt in packs, and tracked mountain lions through dense woods. I thought I knew everything about the wilderness. I was wrong. Before I tell you what really happened in September of 1978, you need to understand something about me. I don't believe in monsters. Never did. When tourists came to me with stories about Bigfoot sightings in the Superior National Forest, I'd smile politely and explain how a black bear standing on its back legs could look like a giant man from a distance. When they showed me blurry photos of creatures in the woods, I'd point out the shadows and explain how our minds play tricks on us when we're scared. I became a ranger after my husband died in Vietnam. The forest was my escape, my peace. The Boundary Waters area of Minnesota became my home, 20 miles of wilderness accessible only by canoe. Most people found it too isolated, too quiet. I found it perfect. That September was beautiful. The leaves were turning gold and red, and the early morning frost made everything sparkle like diamonds. I was assigned to check on some campsites along the portage route between Basswood and Crooked Lakes. There had been reports of unusual animal activity, destroyed campsites, scattered gear, and some very frightened campers. My supervisor, Jim Patterson, briefed me at the ranger station. 3 separate incidents in the past 2 weeks, he said, spreading photos across his desk. All along the same general area. Could be a rogue bear, maybe sick or injured. Makes them more aggressive. I looked at the photos. Torn tents, scattered food supplies, overturned canoes. Standard bear damage, I thought. Any injuries? I asked. None reported. Folks cleared out fast. Jim handed me a clipboard with the incident reports. But her is the thing that's got me puzzled. No bear scat, no claw marks on the trees. Usually when a bear hits a campsite, you find evidence everywhere. I spent that afternoon loading my canoe with supplies. Extra rope, first aid kit, camera, and my trusty .30-06 rifle. In 19 years, I'd only fired it twice, both times to scare off aggressive animals, never to kill. The forest deserved respect, not fear. The paddle to Basswood Lake took 3 hours. The water was glass smooth, reflecting the colorful trees like a perfect mirror. Loons called across the water, their voices echoing off the rocky shores. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. I made camp on a small island just as the sun was setting. As I cooked dinner over my portable stove, I could hear the forest settling in for the night. Owls hooting, the splash of beaver tails, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Sounds I'd heard thousands of times before. But something felt different that night. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Then I realized it was too quiet. No wolves howling, no coyotes yipping. Even the owls seemed muted, distant. The silence pressed against my ears like cotton. I told myself it was just the weather. Early frost sometimes made animals change their patterns. But as I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the stars through my tent window, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the dark tree line across the water. I'd felt eyes on me before. Deer, curious raccoons, even the occasional moose. This was different. This felt aware, intelligent, patient. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. I woke before dawn to absolute silence. No bird songs, no water lapping against the shore, no wind in the trees. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I dressed quickly and broke camp as the first pale light crept across the lake. The Anderson family's campsite was my first stop. They'd been the most recent incident just 3 days ago, according to the reports. What I found there changed everything. The campsite wasn't just damaged. It was destroyed with a precision that made no sense for any animal I knew. Their large family tent had been shredded, but not randomly. The tiers followed specific patterns, almost like someone had used giant claws to write symbols in the fabric. Their canoe sat upright in the shallow water, completely undamaged. But around it, pressed deep into the mud, were footprints that made my blood freeze. 18 inches long, 5 toes, clearly defined. Too big for any human, wrong shape for a bear. The depth of the impressions suggested something incredibly heavy, maybe 800 pounds or more. The prints led from the water's edge to the campsite, then disappeared into the forest. I pulled out my camera and started documenting everything. As I photographed the footprints, I noticed something else that didn't make sense. Claw marks on a large pine tree, but they were 12 feet off the ground. No bear could reach that high, even standing on its back legs. Jesus, I whispered, stepping back to look at the full scope of the markings. 4 parallel gouges, each one deep enough to stick my finger into. Whatever made these marks had claws like railroad spikes. I followed the trail into the forest, marking my path with orange tape. The footprints were easy to track in the soft soil, but they led to places no normal animal should go. Up steep, rocky slopes that would challenge an experienced climber, through dense thickets of thorns that would tear any normal creature apart. About a mile from the campsite, I found the first piece of evidence that this wasn't just property damage. A child's shoe. Small, maybe size 2, bright red with cartoon characters on the side. It was sitting on a fallen log, placed there deliberately, not dropped or lost. The shoe was clean, no mud or scuff marks despite being in the forest for 3 days. I picked it, up with trembling hands, and called out, "Hello? Is anyone out there? This is Ranger Thornfield." My voice echoed through the trees and died away. The silence that followed felt hungry, expectant. That's when I heard it for the first time. A sound that wasn't quite human, wasn't quite animal. Low, rumbling, like a growl mixed with speech. It came from somewhere deeper in the forest, too distant to pinpoint but close enough to make every hair on my body stand up. I drew my rifle and chambered around. "I'm armed," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "If someone's hurt, I can help. If you're playing games, stop now." The only answer was that sound again, longer this time, more complex, like language I couldn't understand. I found the second shoe 50 yards away, placed on another fallen log with the same careful positioning. Then a child's jacket hung on a low branch like someone was displaying it. My radio crackled to life, startling me so badly I nearly dropped my rifle. "Base to Thornfield. Come in." I fumbled for the handset. "Thornfield here. How's it looking out there, Beth? Find anything interesting?" I stared at the jacket hanging in front of me, so small it could only belong to a 4 or 5-year-old child. "Jim, I need you to run a check on the Anderson family. The incident report said no injuries, but I'm finding children's clothing out here." Static filled the radio for a long moment. "Stand by." While I waited, I continued following the trail. The footprints led deeper into the forest, to areas I'd never explored even in 19 years of ranger work. Ancient pines towered above me, some so wide 3 people couldn't wrap their arms around them. The canopy was so thick barely any sunlight filtered through. The radio crackled again. "Beth, we've got a problem. I just called the outfitter who arranged the Anderson trip. Family of 4, 2 parents, 2 kids, ages 4 and 7. They were supposed to check in yesterday. Nobody's heard from them." My mouth went dry. "Jim, I think we need to call in a search and rescue team." "Already on. Chet, state police are mobilizing. ETA is 4 hours by float plane. Can you continue the search until they arrive?" I looked ahead into the dark forest, then back at the child's jacket in my hands. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, paddle back to safety, and wait for backup. But somewhere in these woods, 2 children might still be alive. "I'll keep looking," I said into the radio. "But Jim, bring heavy equipment. Whatever's out here, it's not a bear." The trail led me deeper into territory I'd never seen before, though I'd worked this forest for nearly 2 decades. The trees grew larger and older, their trunks scarred with markings that looked almost like primitive writing. The ground became spongy with centuries of fallen needles, muffling my footsteps until I moved in complete silence. About 2 miles from the Anderson campsite, the footprints stopped at a clearing dominated by a massive pine tree. This wasn't just any tree. It was ancient, easily 300 years old, its trunk so wide that 20 people holding hands couldn't circle it. But what made my knees buckle wasn't the tree itself. It was what was arranged around it. 4 small forms lay in a perfect circle around the tree's base. Even from a distance, I could see the bright colors of children's clothing. My hands shook so badly I could barely focus my binoculars, but I had to look. I had to know. The Anderson children lay on beds of pine needles, their small bodies positioned with disturbing care. Their faces were peaceful, eyes closed, hands folded over their chests like they were sleeping. But the massive claw wounds across their throats told a different story. What terrified me most wasn't the violence. It was the deliberate nature of it all. Someone or something had arranged them like offerings, like a ritual. Pine branches heavy with needles covered their legs. Wildflowers I didn't recognize were woven into their hair. I forced myself to approach, documenting everything with my camera even as my stomach churned. Up close, I could see that the wounds were too large for any known predator. The claw marks were consistent with what I'd seen on the tree back at the campsite, impossibly deep, impossibly wide. As I photographed the scene, my radio crackled with static. I tried to call base camp, but got only white noise. The device was working fine earlier. Now it was completely dead. That's when I noticed the silence again. Not just quiet, complete absence of sound. No wind, no insects, no birds. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, absorbed by the giant tree above me. I stood up from examining the second child and froze. Across the clearing, maybe 30 yards away, something large moved between the trees. Just a shadow at first, then a glimpse of reddish-brown fur. Too tall to be a bear, too broad to be human. "Who's there?" I called out, raising my rifle. "I'm a forest ranger. Show yourself." The shadow stopped moving. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I heard that sound again, the low rumbling vocalization that wasn't quite human. But this time it seemed to come from multiple sources, surrounding the clearing. I spun in a slow circle, rifle ready, trying to track the sounds. North side of the clearing, a glimpse of something massive disappearing behind a tree. East side, the snap of a heavy branch, too high up to be from any normal animal. South side, a shape that might have been watching me, gone when I looked directly at it. They were circling me. The realization hit like ice water in my veins. Whatever killed the Anderson family wasn't gone. It was here, right now, and it wasn't alone. I backed toward the giant tree, pressing my spine against its rough bark. At least nothing could approach from behind. My radio was still dead, and even if it worked, help was hours away. I was alone in the wilderness with predators that could tear apart a family and arrange their bodies like some twisted art installation. A branch cracked. Behind me. Impossible. The tree trunk was solid. Nothing could be behind me. But I heard it again, directly overhead. I looked up into the canopy and saw something that made my mind struggle to process what I was seeing. 20 feet above me, clinging to the massive tree trunk, was a face, human-like but wrong in every detail. Too large, covered in coarse reddish hair, with eyes that glowed yellow in the dim light. The intelligence in those eyes was unmistakable and absolutely terrifying. It was studying me with the same clinical interest I'd used to examine the dead children. I brought my rifle up, but the face disappeared, moving with impossible speed and silence through the branches above. A shower of pine needles rained down on me. "What do you want?" I shouted at the canopy. "What the hell are you?" The answer came as images flooding into my mind. Not words, but pictures, emotions, memories that weren't mine. I saw the forest as it had been hundreds of years ago, untouched by humans. I felt a presence that had watched over these woods since before recorded history. I experienced a rage so pure and ancient, it made me stagger. Territory, invasion, protection, punishment. The concepts flowed through my consciousness like a freezing river. These things, whatever they were, considered themselves guardians of the deep forest. The Anderson family had camped in a place considered sacred, forbidden. They had been removed as a warning that apparently I was also ignoring. More images flooded my mind. I saw myself as they saw me, a small, fragile invader carrying death tools, documenting their sacred spaces with strange devices. I felt their debate about what to do with me. Some wanted to add me to the circle around the tree. Others saw value in letting me carry their message back to my kind. I realized I was witnessing some form of telepathic communication between multiple entities. They were deciding my fate, and I was somehow picking up fragments of their ancient alien thought patterns. The images stopped abruptly, leaving me gasping and disoriented. When my vision cleared, I was no longer alone in the clearing. 3 figures stood at the forest edge, partially hidden in shadow, but unmistakably present. They were massive. The smallest was easily 8 feet tall, the largest closer to 10. Their bodies were proportioned like exaggerated humans, covered in thick, reddish-brown fur. But their faces held an intelligence that was both human and utterly foreign. The largest stepped forward, and I understood with crystalline clarity that this was their alpha, their leader, their final decision-maker. When it looked at me, those glowing yellow eyes seemed to peer directly into my soul. I knew, with absolute certainty, that it could kill me without any more effort than I'd use to swat a mosquito. But it was waiting for something, testing me. Very slowly I lowered my rifle, not putting it down. That would be suicide, but showing I wasn't immediately threatening them. The alpha tilted its massive head, considering this gesture. Then it began to move toward me, each step deliberate and measured. The ground trembled slightly under its weight. Behind it, the other 2 creatures spread out, flanking me. In that moment, standing in a circle of dead children while 3 impossible predators closed in around me, I understood that everything I thought I knew about the natural world was laughably wrong, and my real education was about to begin. The alpha creature stopped just 10 feet away from me, close enough that I could see the individual hairs of its coat, the ancient scars crisscrossing its massive arms, the way its nostrils flared as it analyzed my scent. Up close, the sheer size of it was overwhelming. Not just it, tall but built like a living wall of muscle and bone. Its eyes never left mine as more images flooded into my mind. This time the communication was deliberate, controlled. It was showing me exactly what it wanted me to understand. I saw the forest as it existed in their world, not just trees and animals, but a living network of sacred spaces, territorial boundaries invisible to human eyes, and ancient laws that governed every aspect of wilderness life. The giant tree behind me wasn't just old. It was a focal point, a place where their kind had gathered for centuries to make decisions about their territory. The Anderson family hadn't just camped in the wrong place. They had pitched their tent directly over what amounted to a sacred burial ground. Their children had played and laughed where countless generations of these creatures had laid their dead to rest. To the entities surrounding me, this wasn't trespassing. This was desecration. The images shifted, showing me other incidents over the years. Loggers whose equipment mysteriously failed in certain areas. Hunters who became lost and were found days later babbling about something watching them from the trees. Hikers who reported feeling an overwhelming compulsion to leave specific trails, never understanding why. These creatures had been protecting their territory for generations, usually through subtle deterrence. The Anderson family massacre wasn't typical. It was an escalation, a response to increasing human presence in areas they considered sacred. But the most terrifying revelation came last. Through fragmented images and alien emotions, I understood that I was witnessing something unprecedented. These entities rarely revealed themselves so directly to humans. My presence here, in this sacred clearing, at this moment, was no coincidence. They had been watching me for years. Every patrol through the deep forest, every night I'd camped alone in the wilderness, every time I'd felt unseen eyes tracking my movements, they had been there, studying me, learning about me. In their minds, I saw reflected memories of myself from their perspective, a small figure moving respectfully through their domain, someone who understood the forest's moods and rhythms, who took only what was necessary and left only footprints. To them, I was different from other humans. I was worthy of communication rather than elimination. But that protection came with a price. The Alpha's thoughts pressed against my mind with crushing intensity. Images of other humans, park rangers, wildlife officials, search and rescue teams, approaching their sacred territories. A growing invasion that threatened everything they had protected for centuries. They needed someone to carry a message back to my kind, someone who would be believed, someone with authority. The message was simple and absolute. Stay away from the deep forest, or face the consequences the Anderson family had experienced. As these revelations crashed over me, I became aware that the other two creatures had moved closer. They flanked me now, cutting off any possible retreat. The smallest of the three, though still massive by human standards, approached from my left side. It was then that I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. This wasn't just any creature. It was female, and she was protecting something. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows at the forest edge, I glimpsed a smaller figure, younger, a juvenile. She had brought her child to witness this encounter. The female's thoughts touched my mind more gently than the Alpha's, but the message was crystal clear. She was showing me that they were not monsters. They were a family, protecting their home, their young, their way of life. The violence against the Anderson children hadn't been casual cruelty. It had been the desperate act of parents defending their territory. But I was still holding a rifle, and I was standing in their most sacred space. And despite their attempt at communication, I was still an invader. The Alpha's patience was wearing thin. I could feel it in the increasing pressure of his mental presence, see it in the way his massive hands flexed, revealing claws that could tear through tree bark like paper. The female was growing agitated too, her protective instincts triggered by my proximity to her young. I had perhaps seconds to make a decision that would determine whether I joined the Anderson children in their circle around the ancient tree or walked out of this forest alive. Very slowly, I set my rifle on the ground and stepped away from it. The Alpha's eyes followed my movements, calculating, evaluating. Then I did something that went against every survival instinct I possessed. I knelt, not in submission, but in respect. The same way I would approach a wounded animal, showing that I understood I was in their space, subject to their rules, asking for permission rather than demanding passage. The effect was immediate. The pressure in my mind eased. The female's agitation lessened. Even the juvenile crept slightly closer, curiosity overcoming caution. But the Alpha wasn't finished with me yet. More images flowed into my consciousness, what they expected of me when I returned to civilization. I would file reports blaming the Anderson deaths on a rogue bear, already destroyed by park officials. I would recommend that certain areas of the forest be designated as off-limits to camping and hiking, citing environmental concerns. I would use my authority and credibility to create buffer zones around their most sacred territories. And if I failed to do this, if I brought more humans into the deep forest seeking evidence of their existence, they would emerge from hiding and protect their territory with the full force of their ancient fury. The images of what that would mean were too terrible to fully comprehend. Not just individual deaths, but systematic elimination of anyone who ventured into their domain. They would transform from hidden guardians into open predators. The alpha stepped Ev. In closer, until I could feel the heat radiating from its massive body, could smell the wild scent of fur and earth, and something indefinably ancient. Those glowing eyes bored into mine, and I understood that this was the moment of final judgment. I nodded once, accepting their terms. The relief that flooded through the clearing was palpable. The female creature visibly relaxed, and her juvenile boldly stepped into full view. A smaller version of the adults, maybe 5 feet tall, but unmistakably one of their kind. For a brief moment, I was witnessing something no human had ever seen. A family of these ancient beings, allowing me to observe them without fear or aggression. But the moment passed quickly. The alpha made a sound, not quite a growl, not quite a word, and all 3 creatures began backing toward the forest edge. Before they disappeared entirely, the alpha turned back to me one final time. The last image he sent was of myself, walking out of the forest, filing false reports, and keeping their secret. But underneath that image was a warning so clear it made my bones ache. Betray them, and next time there would be no communication, no negotiation, no mercy. Then they were gone, melting into the forest shadows with impossible silence, leaving me alone with the bodies of 2 dead children and the weight of knowledge that would change everything about how I understood the world. I had 15 minutes to decide what story I would tell when the search and rescue team arrived. 15 minutes to choose between truth and survival. I radioed the search team when they were still 10 minutes out, using the emergency frequency that cut through static better than standard channels. My hand shook as I held the handset, but my voice stayed steady. "This is Ranger Thornfield. I've located the Anderson children. You're going to need body bags and the coroner. It was a beyond or attack. Probably a large male. Extremely aggressive. Animal is not in the immediate area, but exercise extreme caution." The lies came surprisingly easily. Maybe because the alternative, trying to explain what really happened, was impossible. Who would believe that ancient forest guardians had methodically executed a family for camping in the wrong spot? Who would accept that creatures from native legends were real, intelligent, and willing to communicate telepathically with humans? Nobody. They'd transfer me to a desk job and order psychiatric evaluation. By the time the float plane landed on Basswood Lake, I had my story straight. Rogue black bear, unusually large and aggressive. Evidence suggested it had been stalking the family before attacking at night. The children had tried to run but were caught in the forest. The ritualistic arrangement of the bodies? Just coincidence. Predators sometimes exhibit strange behaviors when feeding is interrupted. The state police investigators bought it completely. Bear attacks, while rare, weren't unprecedented. The claw marks on the trees, the massive footprints, the savage wounds on the victims, all consistent with an exceptionally large and aggressive black bear. What they didn't ask about, because I didn't mention them, were the telepathic communications, the intelligence I'd seen in those glowing eyes, or the family structure of the creatures. Those details went into a report I filed in my personal records, locked in a safe deposit box in Grand Rapids. The parents' bodies were found 2 days later, discovered by tracking dogs at another sacred site 3 miles deeper in the forest. Same story. Bear attack, though these victims had clearly tried to fight back. Mr. Anderson still clutched a camping hatchet with strange reddish hair caught in the blade. I recommended that a 30-square-mile section of the deep forest be declared off-limits to camping, citing environmental concerns about fragile ecosystems and unstable wildlife populations. The recommendation was approved without question. My 19 years of service had earned me credibility that I now used to protect creatures whose existence I couldn't officially acknowledge. but the weight of that knowledge changed me in ways I hadn't expected. 3 weeks after the incident, I requested a transfer to the North Shore District, citing personal reasons. I couldn't return to the deep forest knowing what I now knew. Every patrol route, every campsite inspection, every routine wilderness check carried the possibility of another encounter. Not because I feared them, the Alpha had made the terms of our agreement clear, but because I wasn't sure I could maintain the deception if I witnessed their activities again. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie awake in my new apartment in Duluth, staring at the ceiling and feeling those yellow eyes watching me from the darkness. Not threatening, but present, aware. Sometimes I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder during the day, or scanning tree lines for movement that shouldn't be there. The nightmares started about a month later, not of the creatures themselves, but of the choice I'd made. In my dreams, I stood in that clearing again, but instead of kneeling in respect, I reached for my rifle. Instead of accepting their message, I fought back. The dreams always ended the same way, with me joining the Anderson children in their circle around the ancient tree. I served another 8 years as a ranger, but I never returned to the Boundary Waters. Officially, it was a matter of district assignment. Personally, it was a promise I intended to keep. When I finally retired in 1987, I moved to a small town in northern Wisconsin where the forests were younger, more thoroughly mapped, less likely to harbor ancient secrets. I kept my mouth shut about what I'd seen and learned, filing my real reports in that safe deposit box along with photographs I'd never shown to anyone. But retirement gave me time to research, and what I found disturbed me more than the original encounter. Stories, legends, reports from across North America of similar incidents, unexplained disappearances. In deep wilderness areas, bear attacks that didn't quite make sense. Campsites destroyed with precision that suggested intelligence rather than animal fury. Most were dismissed as folklore or misidentified conventional wildlife encounters. I knew better. The creatures I'd met in that clearing weren't unique to the Superior National Forest. They were part of something larger, older, more widespread than I'd imagined. A hidden population that had coexisted with humans for centuries by remaining invisible, by allowing us to explain away their presence with more palatable theories. They were still out there, still protecting territories that existed on no human maps, still making decisions about which intrusions to tolerate and which to eliminate. And I was keeping their secret. Sometimes, usually late at night when sleep refuses to come, I wonder if I made the right choice. 2 children died because their parents chose the wrong campsite. How many others might die because I helped maintain the conspiracy of silence that protects these creatures? But then I remember the intelligence in those yellow eyes, the telepathic weight of their ancient purpose, the terrible clarity of their final warning. If humans knew the truth about what shares the deep wilderness with us, we wouldn't respectfully avoid their territories. We'd hunt them, study them, exploit them, destroy them. And they wouldn't let that happen. The war that would result from full disclosure would make the Anderson family massacre look like a minor incident. These entities have survived in hiding for centuries because they're intelligent, organized, and absolutely ruthless when protecting their own. So I keep their secret, and I live with the weight of that choice. But I'm 78 years old now, and that safe deposit box won't guard its contents forever. Someone will eventually read these words, see photographs, and have to decide what to do with information that could change how humanity understands its place in the natural world. When that time comes, remember what I learned in that clearing. The deep forest has guardians, and they're watching. They've always been watching. Respect their boundaries, or face the consequences. The choice, as it was for me that September day in 1978, is yours to make. But choose carefully. Some secrets are kept for good reason. My name is Marcus Ironwood, and I've been a park ranger for 16 years. I've seen bears attack campers, watched people fall off cliffs, and pulled more bodies out of rivers than I care to count. But what happened in the Olympic National Park during late November of 1983 still keeps me awake at night. I want to tell you this story because I think people need to know. The official reports say it was a bear attack. The newspapers called it a tragic hunting accident. But I was there. I saw what really happened in those dark woods, and it wasn't any bear. Let me start at the beginning. I was working the Hoh River Valley section back then. It's remote country, thick forests, rushing rivers, and mountains that stretch up to the clouds. The nearest road is 15 miles away, and once you get past the 3-mile mark, your radio stops working. It's the kind of place where you can disappear and nobody will find you for weeks. I'd been divorced for 2 years by then. Used to work construction until the economy went bad in '67. Then I figured being a ranger would give me peace and quiet. I liked the solitude. Never had much use for ghost stories or Indian legends either. The old Quinault tribe folks would sometimes warn me about hungry spirits in the deep woods, but I figured that was just campfire talk to scare tourists. That November was colder than usual. Early snow had already dusted the high peaks, and the temperature was dropping fast. I was getting ready to close some of the backcountry trails for winter when the call came in. 3 hunters had gone missing. Jim Kowalski, age 34, from Seattle, his brother Dave, 28, and their friend Mike Santos, 31. They'd gotten permits to hunt elk in the restricted area, deep in the valley where most people don't go. Their wives had expected them back 3 days ago. I packed my gear. First aid kit, M. Urgency radio, flares, enough food for 4 days, standard search and rescue protocol. I'd done this dozens of times before. Most missing persons cases end with someone getting lost, running out of food, and walking out on their own feeling embarrassed. Sometimes you find them injured. Sometimes you find them dead from exposure or a fall. But you always find an explanation that makes sense. I hiked in alone, following the trail markers toward their last known position. The woods felt wrong from the start. Too quiet. No bird songs, no squirrel chatter, no sounds at all except my boots crunching through dead leaves. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Sweet and rotten, like meat left out in the sun too long. But it was November. Everything should have been clean and cold. I followed my nose and found their campsite just before sunset. The scene didn't make sense. Their tent was torn apart from the inside, fabric hanging in strips like something had clawed its way out. Sleeping bags were shredded and scattered across the clearing. Canned food lay everywhere, opened but not eaten. Their rifles were still in the gun cases, unused. I called out their names, but the silence swallowed my voice. No echo came back from the surrounding trees. That's when I found the first set of tracks. They looked human at first glance, bare footprints in the soft earth around their camp. But they were too long, too narrow, with claw marks at the tips where toes should be. And they were huge, maybe size 16 or 17. The stride length suggested someone nearly 8 feet tall. My radio crackled with static. I tried calling base station but got nothing except white noise and what sounded like whispers in a language I didn't recognize. Must be atmospheric interference, I told myself. Happens sometimes in the mountains. But deep down, I was starting to feel afraid. The tracks led north, deeper into the restricted wilderness area where even experienced hunters rarely go. I had to make a choice. Set up camp and wait for backup, or follow the trail while I still had light. The temperature was dropping fast, and if those men were injured and alone out there, every hour counted. I shouldered my pack and followed the tracks into the gathering darkness. The trail led me through sections of forest I'd never seen before, even after 16 years patrolling these woods. Ancient cedars rose like cathedral columns around me, their branches so thick they blocked out the stars. The strange footprints were easy to follow in the soft earth, but they seemed to wander without purpose, circling back on themselves, leading to nowhere. About 2 miles from the campsite, I found Jim Kowalski's hunting jacket hanging from a branch 12 feet off the ground. It was torn and bloody, but there was no way he could have climbed up there to hang it himself. The tree trunk was smooth bark with no handholds. I tried my radio again. Nothing but that weird, whispering static. The sound made my skin crawl, like voices talking just low enough that I couldn't make out the words. The temperature kept dropping. My breath came out in white puffs, and frost was forming on the ferns despite the fact that it had been nearly 50 degrees that afternoon. Something was making the air itself turn cold. I switched on my flashlight and kept following the tracks. They led me to a small clearing where I found the first body. It was Dave Kowalski, Jim's younger brother. At least I thought it was Dave based on the wallet in his back pocket. It was hard to tell for sure because something had been feeding on him. He was lying on his back, arms spread wide, eyes staring up at the stars. But his chest and stomach had been torn open, ribs cracked apart like he was a lobster someone had split for dinner. The strange thing was how clean it looked. No blood on the ground around him, no mess, like something had licked up every drop. But here's where it really scared me. Dave was frozen solid. Not just cold, but frozen like he'd been in a deep freeze for weeks. When I touched his hand to check for a pulse, it felt like touching a block of ice. His skin was blue-white and hard as stone. The temperature around me was cold, sure, but not below freezing. My water bottle wasn't frozen. The puddles nearby weren't iced over. So why was Dave frozen like a piece of meat in a freezer? I heard a sound then, a low moan echoing through the trees. It sounded human, like someone in terrible pain. "Help me," the voice called. "Please help me." My heart jumped. One of the other hunters was still alive. "Where are you?" I shouted back. "Keep talking, I'm coming." The voice came again, closer this time. "Over here. I'm hurt bad. Please hurry." I followed the sound deeper into the woods, stepping carefully around fallen logs and thorny bushes. My flashlight beam swept back and forth, searching for any sign of movement. "Keep talking," I called. "I'm a park ranger. I'm here to help." "I can't move," the voice answered. But something was wrong with it. The words were right, but they sounded flat somehow, like someone reading lines from a script. "My legs are broken. I'm so cold." I pushed through a wall of cedar branches and found myself in another small clearing. My flashlight beam swept across the space, but found nothing. No injured hunter, no sign that anyone had been there. "Hello?" I called out. "Where are you?" Silence. I was starting to realize I'd been tricked, but tricked by what? Who could throw their voice like that in the middle of the wilderness, and why? That's when I heard something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. It was the same voice that had been calling for help, but now it was laughing. A low, hungry chuckle that didn't sound human at all, and it was coming from directly above me. I looked up and saw Mike Santos hanging upside down from a tree branch 20 feet overhead. His arms dangled loose, swaying slightly in the wind. But he wasn't moving on his own. He wasn't moving at all. Mike was dead, completely drained of blood like a deer hung up in a butcher shop. His skin was pale white, almost see-through, and his eyes were gone. Just empty sockets staring down at me. The laughing sound came again, but Mike's mouth didn't move. It was coming from somewhere else in the darkness. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush like a panicked deer, branches tearing at my jacket, roots trying to trip me with every step. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I stumbled and fell and got back up again. Behind me, I could hear something large moving through the trees, keeping pace with me easily. It was playing with me. I could tell by the way it would get close enough for me to hear its breathing, then fall back just out of sight. Like a cat toying with a mouse before the kill. I made it back to Dave's body and stopped to catch my breath. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst. I tried the radio one more time and got the same static whispers, but now they sounded like laughter. That's when I realized something that made me even more afraid. The tracks around Dave's body weren't the same as the ones I'd been following from the campsite. These were different, smaller, more human-looking. They were Dave's own footprints. He'd walked here himself, laid down on his back, and then something had frozen him solid and started feeding. Whatever was out there in the darkness, it didn't just hunt people, it made them want to be caught. I knew I had to get out of there, but I also knew I'd never make it back to the trailhead in the dark. Whatever was hunting me could see in the darkness better than I could. My only chance was to find shelter, build a fire, and wait for dawn. I remembered seeing an old ranger shelter about half a mile east of the clearing. It was just a three-sided lean-to with a stone fire ring, but it would give me something solid at my back and a way to make light. I started moving as quietly as I could, trying not to use my flashlight unless I had to. Every shadow looked like something crouched and ready to spring. Every wind sound through the trees sounded like breathing. The strange thing was how my equipment kept acting up. My compass needle spun in slow circles, never settling on magnetic north. The GPS unit I carried for emergencies kept showing impossible readings, like I was moving at 60 miles per hour while standing still, or that I was somehow 300 feet underground. Worst of all was my watch. The digital display kept changing, showing times that made no sense. 3:47 a.m., then 11:23 p.m., then 6:66 p.m. The last reading made me want to throw the thing away, but I needed to keep track of how long until sunrise. I found the shelter just as my flashlight batteries started to die. The wooden structure looked solid enough, and there was even some dry firewood stacked against one wall from previous visitors. I gathered kindling and got a small fire going, then sat with my back against the rear wall where I could see anyone approaching. The fire helped with my nerves, but it also created dancing shadows that made everything beyond the light look alive and moving. I kept my flare gun ready and tried to think through my situation logically. 3 hunters were dead, killed by something that could freeze a grown man solid and drain his blood, something that could mimic human voices and throw its voice to trick people. Something that left tracks like a barefoot giant but moved through the forest without making a sound. I'd heard stories like this before from the old Kino elders, but I'd never believed them. Tales of Wendigos, cannibal spirits that were once human but gave in to hunger and became something else. According to the legends, they were always cold, always starving, and they coerce. It'd make people want to feed themselves to it. But those were just stories, weren't they? Around midnight, I heard Jim Kowalski's voice calling from the darkness beyond my fire. Marcus, is that you? Thank God, I've been looking for you everywhere. Jim sounded relieved, excited, completely normal. Nothing like the flat, script-reading voice that had tricked me before. If I hadn't seen his brother's frozen body with my own eyes, I might have believed it was really him. Jim, I called back. Stay where you are. I'm coming to you. But I didn't move. I stayed right where I was, flare gun aimed at the sound of his voice. I can't move, Marcus. My ankle's twisted bad. I need you to help me to the fire. What's your wife's name, Jim? I asked. Silence. Come on, Jim. If it's really you, tell me your wife's name. When the voice came back, it was different, colder. Why won't you help me, Marcus? I'm hurt and scared. Don't you want to save me? Because you're not Jim, I said. Jim's probably dead like his brother. The thing in the darkness started laughing. But now it wasn't trying to sound human anymore. The laugh was like wind through a cemetery, like winter itself finding something funny. Smart Ranger, it said, and the voice kept changing. Sometimes Jim's voice, sometimes Dave's, sometimes Mike's, sometimes all three talking at once. But not smart enough. You can't sit by that fire forever. It was right. My firewood wouldn't last until dawn, and I couldn't stay awake much longer. I'd been hiking for 12 hours, and exhaustion was making my hands shake. What do you want? I asked the darkness. Want? The voice sounded puzzled, like I'd asked a stupid question. I want to eat. I'm always hungry, Ranger. Always cold, always empty. And you smell so warm, so full of life. Something moved just at the edge of my firelight. A pale shape, tall and thin, that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. When I tried to look directly at it, it vanished. But I could see it clearly from the corner of my eye. An impossibly tall figure, with arms too, had hung down to its knees and a face that was just shadows and teeth. I used to be human, it said conversationally. Long time ago, had a name, had a family. But I got so hungry one winter, so hungry that I ate things I shouldn't have eaten, did things I shouldn't have done, Now I can't stop eating, can't stop being cold, can't stop wanting more. The shape moved closer, and I could smell death rolling off it like fog, sweet corruption and old bones and something else, the smell of a slaughterhouse. You killed those hunters, I said. Killed them? The thing sounded amused. Oh no, Ranger. I didn't kill anyone. They came to me, wanted to feed me. Dave laid right down and asked me to make him cold like I am. Mike climbed that tree himself and hung there waiting for me to drink. Jim's still around here somewhere looking for you. He wants to bring you to me as a present. My fire was burning lower. The shadows were getting bigger, reaching toward me with black fingers. That's not possible, I said, but my voice sounded weak even to me. Isn't it? The voice was right behind me now, somehow inside the shelter even though I hadn't seen it approach. You felt it too, didn't you, Marcus? When you found Dave's body, that little voice in your head that said, maybe you should just lie down next to him. Maybe you should close your eyes and let the cold take you too. It was right. I had felt something like that. A strange urge to just give up, to stop fighting and let whatever was going to happen just happen. I'd pushed the feeling away, but it had been there. I can make the hunger stop, Marcus. Make all the fear stop. You just have to let me. I turned around slowly, flare gun ready. Jim Kowalski was standing right behind me, not 3 feet away. But it wasn't really Jim. This thing was wearing Jim's face like a mask, and underneath I could see something else looking out through his eyes. Something old and hungry and completely inhuman. Hello, Marcus, it said in Jim's voice. I've been waiting for you. The thing wearing Jim's face smiled, and I could see that its teeth were wrong. Too sharp, too many of them, going back way too far into its mouth. When it spoke, cold fog came out with every word. You're scared, it said, tilting Jim's head at an angle no living person could manage. Good. Fear makes the meat taste better, makes it more nutritious. I kept the flare gun pointed at its chest, but my hands were shaking so bad I wasn't sure I could hit anything. The fire behind me was almost dead now, just a few red coals giving off barely any light. You're not Jim, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Jim's dead, isn't he? Jim is with me, the thing replied. It took a step closer, and I could see that its feet weren't touching the ground. It was floating an inch above the forest floor. Just like Dave is with me. Just like Mike is with me. We're all together now, Marcus. One big, happy family. As it spoke, I could hear other voices whispering from the darkness around the shelter. Dave's voice, Mike's voice, and others I didn't recognize. How many people had this thing killed over the years? The Kino people used to know about me, it continued, reading my thoughts somehow. They called me Wendigo, the hunger that walks. They knew better than to come into these deep woods in winter. But white men like you forgot the old warnings. You stopped believing in things that go bump in the night. It laughed, and the sound made the dying coals of my fire flicker. I used to be like you, Marcus. Had a job, had a life. I was a logger working these same forests back in 1952. Got cut off from my crew during a bad storm, spent 3 weeks alone in the woods with no food. By the time the snow cleared enough for me to travel, I was so hungry I'd eaten my own fingers. The thing that looked like Jim held up its hands. The fingers were just bones now, white and gleaming in the faint light. But that wasn't enough. And nothing was ever enough after that. I found a family of campers and well, you can guess what I did. Each person I ate made me hungrier. Each life I took made me colder. Until I wasn't human anymore. Until I became what you see now. It started circling me slowly, staying just out of range of the flare gun. With each step, the temperature dropped another degree. My breath was coming out in thick white clouds now. The beautiful thing is that my victims want to feed me, it said. That's part of the curse, part of what makes me what I am. I don't have to force anyone. They come willingly. They lay down and ask me to make them cold like I am. They want to join me, Marcus. Just like you're starting to want it too. And it was right. I could feel something tugging at the back of my mind, a voice that wasn't my own whispering that it would be so easy to just put down the flare gun. So easy to close my eyes and let the cold take me. No more fear. No more running. No more fighting against something I couldn't possibly beat. You feel it, don't you? The Wendigo said. That little voice telling you to give up? That's me, Marcus. I'm already inside your head, already part of you. It's just a matter of time now. But something else was fighting against that voice. 16 years of training maybe, or just plain stubborn pride. I'd pulled too many people out of bad situations to quit now. Even if I couldn't save those 3 hunters, maybe I could at least make sure this thing didn't get anyone else. Go to hell, I said, and fired the flare gun directly at its chest. The flare hit the Wendigo square in the center of Jim's borrowed face and exploded in a shower of red sparks. The thing let out a scream that sounded like 1,000 voices all crying out at once, all the people it had killed over the years maybe. It staggered backward, its stolen human shape starting to fall apart like a mask melting in the heat. For a moment I could see what it really looked like underneath. Something tall and skeletal with gray skin stretched tight over bones. Its real face was just a skull with burning coals where the eyes should be and a mouth full of yellowed fangs. Its arms were too long, ending in hands that were just claws and exposed bone. But the flare only slowed it down. It didn't stop it. Clever Ranger, it hissed, its voice now like wind through dead leaves. But fire won't save you. Nothing will save you. I've been hungry for over 30 years, and you're just one more meal. I dropped the spent flare gun and ran. I crashed out of the shelter and into the dark forest, branches whipping at my face as I stumbled over roots and fallen logs. Behind me I could hear the Wendigo following, but now it wasn't pretending to be human anymore. It was making sounds like a pack of wolves, like ice cracking, like the earth itself groaning under some terrible weight. I had no idea where I was going. My compass was still spinning, my GPS was still showing impossible readings, and the stars were hidden by the thick canopy overhead. All I could do was run and hope I'd find somewhere safe before the thing caught up with me. That's when I heard the sound of running water somewhere ahead, a stream or river moving fast over rocks. I remembered something from the old Quinault legends. Evil spirits couldn't cross running water. It probably wasn't true, but it was the only hope I had left. I stumbled down a steep slope toward the sound, half running and half falling through the underbrush. The noise behind me was getting closer, and I could feel cold air on the back of my neck like the thing was breathing on me. The stream turned out to be more like a small river, maybe 20 feet across and running fast with snowmelt from the mountains. The water was so cold it made my teeth ache just looking at it, but I didn't have a choice. I waded in up to my waist, gasping as the ice-cold water soaked through my clothes. The current was strong enough to tuck me over if I wasn't careful, but I pushed across toward the far shore. The Wendigo appeared on the bank behind me just as I reached the middle of the river. In the faint starlight reflecting off the water, I could see it clearly for the first time. It was even more horrible than I'd imagined. 8 feet tall, thin as a scarecrow, with arms that hung down past its knees. Its face was a nightmare of sharp angles and too many teeth. But when it reached the water's edge, it stopped. Clever, it said again, and now its voice sounded different. Frustrated. Maybe even a little afraid. Running water. I should have expected that from a ranger who's spent time with the tribal elders. It paced back and forth along the shore like a caged animal, but it didn't try to enter the water. This won't save you forever, it called across the river. I have time, Marcus. I have all the time in the world. And eventually, you'll have to come back to dry land. But I was already moving, wading downstream as fast as the current would let me. The water was so cold I couldn't feel my legs anymore, and I knew I'd die of hypothermia if I stayed in much longer. But maybe I could get far enough away that the thing would lose interest. Maybe I could find another way back to the trailhead. I stayed in the water for almost an hour, following the stream as it wound through the forest. Finally, when I couldn't feel anything below my waist and my whole body was shaking uncontrollably, I climbed out on the far shore and started hiking toward where I thought the trail might be. I never saw the Wendigo again that night, but I could feel it watching me from somewhere in the darkness, waiting for another chance. I made it back to my truck just after dawn, more dead than alive. My clothes were frozen solid, my lips were blue, and I couldn't stop shaking long enough to get the keys in the ignition. But I was alive, which was more than those 3 hunters could say. The drive out of the mountains took 2 hours, and I spent most of it trying to figure out how to explain what had happened. Who was going to believe a story about a cannibal spirit that could mimic voices and make people want to feed themselves to it? I'd been a rational, skeptical man my whole life. If someone had told me this story, I would have recommended they see a psychiatrist. When I reached the ranger station, I called in the deaths and gave my official report. I said I'd found 3 bodies, cause of death unknown, but probably animal attack. I mentioned the strange condition of the bodies and the unusual circumstances, but I didn't mention the Wendigo. I figured I'd save that for later, after I'd had time to think about it. The recovery team went in the next day with helicopters and dogs. They found Dave Kowalski's body exactly where I'd said it would be, but Mike Santos had apparently fallen from the tree during the night. His body was badly damaged from the fall, which explained away the missing blood and other injuries. They never found Jim Kowalski at all. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead. The medical examiner ruled all 3 deaths accidental. Dave had apparently died of exposure. Mike had fallen from a tree while trying to hang food away from bears, and Jim had probably fallen in a river and drowned somewhere downstream. Case closed. I never told anyone the real story. Not my supervisor, not the families, not the reporters who called asking for details. What was the point? The men were dead either way, and nothing I could say would bring them back. But I did start paying more attention to the old Quinault elders when they talked about the deep woods. I learned that stories about the Wendigo go back hundreds of years in these mountains. Always the same pattern. People disappearing in winter, bodies found drained of blood or frozen solid in impossible ways. The tribal rangers knew to stay out of certain areas during the cold months, but they'd never told their white colleagues why. I requested a transfer to a different section of the park the following month. Told my supervisor I needed a change of scenery, which wasn't exactly a lie. I spent the rest of my career working the coastal areas where there were always plenty of people around and nothing worse than the occasional aggressive sea lion. But I never forgot that night in the Hoh River Valley. And sometimes, especially in winter when the wind is howling and the temperature drops below freezing, I still hear voices calling for help from the darkness. I know better than to answer now. I retired from the Park Service in 1995, 12 years after my encounter with the Wendigo. I moved to a small town in Arizona where it never snows and there are no deep forests. I thought I'd left all that behind me. But last winter I got a letter from a young ranger working my old territory. He'd heard about the missing hunters case and wanted to ask me some questions. 3 more people had disappeared in the same area, he said. 2 hikers and a photographer, all experienced outdoors people who knew better than to take stupid risks. I wrote back and told him to stay out of the restricted wilderness area during the cold months. I told him to listen to the tribal elders when they gave warnings about the deep woods. And I told him that some cases are better left unsolved, some mysteries better left alone. I don't know if he listened. I hope he did. The thing I met in those woods is still out there, still hungry, still cold, still looking for people foolish enough to wander into its territory when winter comes. It's been feeding for over 70 years now, and it's not going to stop anytime soon. So if you're ever hiking in the Olympic National Park, and you're thinking about taking a shortcut through the backcountry, and you hear someone calling for help from deep in the forest, don't answer. Don't go looking. Just turn around and walk away as fast as you can, because some hungers can never be satisfied, and some things that call your name in the darkness are better, left unfed. My name is Marcus Ironwood, and I'm telling you this story because I want you to live long enough to never have to tell one like it yourself. Trust me on this one. Some experiences aren't worth having.